Good evening, welcome everyone. We're so happy that you could join us for what should be a truly remarkable program tonight. My name's Anna Newton and I'm the leader of the Stop Extinction Action Team, which is one branch of the Act for the Earth Community Outreach Ministry team at Unity Church-Unitarian. And this is the group that's sponsoring our conversation tonight. I'd like to recognize a couple of people who are making this work. Madeline, if you want to wave your hand. She's our tech person, tech guru, and she does a fantastic job. Chico Hathaway, do you want to wave your hand? He is the mastermind behind our program tonight, and he'll be the moderator. And Michelle Misi, if you wouldn't mind, I'm not sure we asked you, but we were going to see if you would mind taking notes tonight. That would be great. We also would like to take tonight's session, so if anybody has an objection to that, they can put that in the chat. So we're gathered here this evening to explore factors that are driving environmental crises. Some of you may have watched the companion film for tonight's discussion, A Life on This Planet, in which the incomparable David Attenborough reflects on his professional career and 60 years worth of filming and traveling to remote areas and bringing nature to all of us. If you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it. Around the world, expanding agriculture and resource extraction are putting tremendous pressure on natural systems, on landscapes, on marginalized people, on wildlife. And climate change, we know, is upon us. Species are disappearing at an alarming rate, in large measure because of choices that we humans have made. We've invited some wonderful speakers to join us this evening, and they will be sharing their perspective on these these problems, and will make some suggestions for corrective actions. Chico will handle that part of the program. Before we introduce our speakers, however, I'd like to say a few words on behalf of Act for the Earth and the Stop Extinction team. Tonight, we will in particular be exploring the role of human population, specifically human overpopulation, and the role that that has played in creating and exacerbating the crises that we face. Due to the tragic history of coercive population control in the past, this is an uncomfortable topic, and we need to live with that uncomfortableness. Yet it is also vital to have this conversation. We acknowledge the legacy of social Darwinism and of the 21st century eugenics movement that began in America and was then embraced by the Nazis, with all the gender, racial, ethnic, ableist, religious, and paternalistic biases inherent in decisions made by those in power at the time. We deeply and profoundly regret the pain inflicted on millions of women and their families. We acknowledge that China's enforcement of its one-child policy was undeniably brutal. We would never support such policies. We acknowledge also that this may be a particularly challenging topic for couples or individuals who have been unable to conceive a wished-for child or who have suffered the indescribable pain of the loss of a child, and we hold you in our embrace. As is our custom, I will light a chalice. Over here. We light the chalice as a symbol of our faith, the light of truth, and the warmth of love. As we approach tonight's topic, let us begin with a prayer for compassion. May we approach this evening in a spirit of love for all gathered here. May we behold each person without judgment. May we agree that the decision to have a child is an intensely personal one. May we work together to create a world in which every child is wanted, loved, and cared for, with adequate food, clean water, secure shelter, and access to education and medical care. May we guide each other with kindness as we learn to live in harmony with the natural world, the source of all which sustains us. And at this point, I'm going to let Chico take it away. Chico, go for it.
Very good. Thanks so much, Anna. That was very nice. We appreciate the introduction to our program tonight. Again, I'm Chico Hathaway. I've been a member of Unity Church for about 25 years. I've been active with the Act for the Earth team and the Extinction sub-team for just the past year and a half or so. But as Anna mentioned, I've had a hand in organizing and getting the program for tonight together, and super excited about our evening together. Just to let you all know, the plan for the evening is that we will have the speakers. We have 3 speakers, and I will introduce them in turn, and they will each talk for about 10 minutes each. And after they all speak, we will open up the session to question and answer, and it will be, I'll be moderating that part of the program. And we really want people to put their questions for the speakers in the chat, and you can be doing that as the speakers are giving their presentations. And then all along, even during the panel discussion as well, please keep adding your questions and comments into the chat. We'll try to get to all of those questions when the time comes. If we don't, however, we really will value those because we can use them for future programming. So please do contribute. We won't be taking questions orally. That is, we won't be opening up the microphone so people can ask their questions directly. We're going to use the questions that are in the chat for the use with the panel discussion. So just so folks know that, but really do welcome your questions. Let's see what else here. I guess as Anna mentioned, we will be recording the session tonight so we can make it available for those who were not able to be with us tonight in person. And hopefully that will be a nice resource for folks who want to look at it later on. At the end of the program, there will be some closing words, and that will be our program for this evening. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker tonight is Sofia Pineda Ochoa. She is actually joining us tonight from Houston, Texas, where she is a practicing physician. She is originally from Guadalajara, Mexico, but came to the US some years ago to finish her training and begin her practice in medicine. In recent years, however, she has devoted much of her time and energy to environmentalism, and particularly around the area of animal extinction. She's actually produced several films on the topic, including a feature-length film, Endgame 2050, which I would encourage everyone to watch when they can. And she's currently working on yet another film. So with that introduction, please welcome Sophia.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you for that introduction. And let me first of all make sure that I'm able to share the screen. Okay, share. Well, can you make it? Oh, yeah, there we go.
Looks
Can you
good.
see that okay?
Looks
Okay,
good.
wonderful. Thanks so much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you guys all for organizing this event on such an important topic. It really is a very special point in time that we're living through right now. So I'm really happy when I see events of any kind to raise awareness of these issues that are happening in the world that perhaps don't get as much as attention as I think they should be getting. And to start off, I wanted to show you, just to put a little bit of context into the speed at which things are happening right now. This is an image of a movie that perhaps many of you have watched. It's from The Lion King from Disney. It's about a lion called Simba, a little lion, the one that's in the center. And this film actually came out in 1994. So not too long ago, I was a teenager when this film came out. But since it came out, you'd be surprised to know that the lions in the world have decreased, the population of lions have decreased by 50%. So they have halved. So it's kind of, you know, like I was a teenager when it came out, and I mean, I'm not like 100 years old now, you know, so in a very short period of time, lions have decreased, and it's not an isolated event. You see it with all kinds of different animals. Giraffes, for example, have decreased 40% in 3 decades. Rhinos, according to the WWF, decreased 96% between 1970 and 1992. Black rhinos, so a specific population of rhinos. But it's kind of it's a phenomenon that's happening to all the wildlife. It's not just one animal or the other, it's amphibians, it's all of them. And if you see on this graph, the dotted line in the bottom that says background, that's the velocity at which species normally go extinct. So it's normal for species to go extinct, right? It's, you know, species have a finite lifetime, and it's normal for some species to go extinct. But as you can see, that's not what we're seeing right now. What we're seeing is species are going extinct very quickly, and a lot more species are going extinct than is normal, and they're going extinct 1,000, 10,000 times quicker than they normally would be in history. And I'm talking about wildlife in general, not just like the cute species. For example, sometimes we focus on, I don't know, like frogs, like this very cute frog that I've got over here that I found that picture. Or we'd like to focus on, like, I don't know, koalas or iconic animals like lions, like the one that I started with. It's actually all of the species, all of the wildlife in general. Well, we're seeing declines throughout wildlife, even, for example, insects that we sometimes, you know, don't care about, or we kind of don't, you know, rallied around those animals as much, but nevertheless, you know, they too are declining. You know, this study out of Germany, for example, found that the flying insect biomass decreased by 75% in 27 years. Imagine 75% decline in 27 years. And when you look at, you know, the studies across Mexico, the forest in Mexico, it's something that's replicated everywhere, you know, so it's a concern that's happening not just in one part of the world, but everywhere. So what's happening right now is what biologists have classified as a mass extinction. A lot of species going extinct at the same time. You know, that's what in biological terms it's called. And we call it the 6th mass extinction. Why do we call it the 6th mass extinction? Well, because we can see the carbon records in our history, and we can see that there have been mass extinctions in the past. There have been 5 in the past. And the last one was about 65 million years ago when we lost the dinosaurs. There was, I guess, I don't know if it's a meteorite or an asteroid, I don't know what's the technical term, but a large mass came from space close to the Yucatan Peninsula, and a lot of dust, you know, a lot of smoke and a lot of dust, and the light was covered for a long period of time. And so dinosaurs over time, most of them, you know, went extinct, except for some varieties like the birds and so on. But so it is quite a big deal what's happening right now. It is a special point in our history, what's happening right now. And, you know, sometimes we look at this and we think something like, oh, well, you know, we should be kind to the other animals. We should share our resources with the other wildlife on the planet. We should have compassion for them. Ethically, that's right. Aesthetically, it's good to have biodiversity. And that's all correct. You know, they are the only companions that we know of in the universe, the wildlife, the other animals who are on this planet. But another aspect that sometimes, you know, we don't think about is also how dependent we actually are on wildlife to support our lives. So we actually are a species that relies on a functioning ecosystem to support our lives. And just as an example of that, I grabbed that title from the cover from the National Geographic because it's about insects, and it says, "You'll miss them when they're gone." And, you know, I was thinking about that, like, well, yeah, like it would be a disaster if they would be gone. Insects not only support the ecosystems, like birds feed off of them, reptiles and amphibians feed off of them. But also when it comes to us, you know, perhaps in a more direct way, they also pollinate. You know, the pollinators help produce about 75% of our crop species. So they are very important for even having food and having a variety of different plants that we depend on for food. And so when we think about, you know, what a tragedy this is, that how many species are going extinct, it's natural to think about, well, why? Well, why are they going extinct? And, you know, there's many causes that play a role. I'm showing this example, for example, this rhino. There's animals that are being poached, like elephants, like rhinos. You know, I show the insects, pesticides contribute to their decline, climate change, warming, all of that contributes to the species being lost, the fragmentation of habitats. But by and large, it's pretty non-controversial that the number one driver in general of species extinction of wildlife is simply habitat loss. You know, just us taking more land. Everything's okay? You guys can see me okay, and you guys can see that okay? Okay, good. It's just simply us, you know, taking more land for ourselves, more resources for ourselves. And then what happens to them? Well, they, you know, don't have a place to have their habitat, to have their home, to have food, to have water, and all those things. Obviously, that's on land that I'm referring to. I skipped this slide, but I was just going to mention, obviously, in the ocean, it's different. In the ocean, the major cause for extinctions is that we're simply, you know, overfishing them, fishing them, kind of decimating the oceans. Interesting fact, before I move on, in 1980, which is very close to the year I was born, the number of dolphins that were present at that time, now there's only 13% of them, because most of it, so 87% of the dolphins that were present in 1980 have been decimated, have been killed in fishing nets and so on. So right now we're focusing on land animals. And so we are taking a huge amount of land and resources. Just as an example, according to the World Wildlife Fund, we're leveling on average, imagine this, 1 football pitch worth of forest every 2 seconds. That's pretty dramatic, you know? Just think about, in the time that we have been talking today, since this presentation began, how many football pitches have been leveled. That's you know, it's easy to see how the species are declining at such velocity when we're doing this kind of deforestation. And then we can think, when we see this, well, why are we doing so much deforestation? You know, why are we just leveling so much forest and at such speed? And you know, there's several reasons for that, but the main thing behind this, I guess, movement, behind this phenomenon, is that we have frankly increased our numbers very, very dramatically in the last few decades. And every single one of us has to eat. And so just as an example, I wanted to show you, you know, there's mining, there's cities, there's roads, there's all kinds of things that we use that require land, right? But just to feed us, just for our food production, we're already using, just for that one activity, 50% of all habitable land on the planet. So imagine if just one of our activities alone is using up so much land, it's easy to see how that would co-opt the resources and displace and, you know, have a very negative result for the wildlife that we share this planet with. And I learned this recently, and I thought this was such a fascinating thing. I really wanted to share that because I was very surprised when I learned this. So when we started using agriculture about 11,000 years ago, So, you know, humans have been around, modern humans as we know them today have been around on this planet about 200,000 years, give or take. But up until 11,000 years ago, our numbers on this planet were less than 1 million, were less than 1 million spread throughout the planet. And that I thought was amazing because, you know, now we're almost 8 billion. And, you know, in the city that I live in today, in Houston, there's about 6 million people. So there's 6 times more people in the city that I'm living now than there was in the entire planet 11,000 years ago. So I think that's an interesting thing that puts context into that. And so if you look at our population over time, humanity's population over time, it really is like a hockey stick. If you can see this, it's like a hockey stick. It's flat for all of human history, and then it kind of shoots straight up. And so it's easy to see how, you know, in the past, the majority of the biomass of the planet was wild animals. But now today, the biomass of wild animals is very, very small. Here it says 4%, but that's rapidly shrinking. And, you know, humans, we are about 36% of the biomass, livestock, 60%. So it really goes to show how we could potentially help wild animals, help this extinction situation that's happening significantly by, you know, raising awareness about our population. And just with this image, though, you see that huge cow. It also goes to show how, in addition to that, and to buy us time for us to do that, you know, changing our food habits, changing our consumption patterns could also be very, very beneficial for wildlife as well. And when we see things like, for example, this is something I got from the United Nations report, and they said the livestock sector is by far the single largest user of land. When we see something like that, the natural question that sometimes we ask ourselves is, well, if humanity is growing so quickly, 1 million people every 5 days, why isn't everything a problem? Why isn't apples a problem? Why isn't avocados a problem? And the answer to that is they are. Like every single thing that we have to produce, when we have to scale it up for a population of 8 billion, is a problem. You know, every single thing we produce. However, livestock, animal foods are disproportionately a problem just because there's an inefficiency issue related with that. Because when we consume animal foods, animals use up a lot of calories just to live. And of all the calories that are used to feed them, to grow them, only a fraction gets back to us in the form of animal foods. So there's a lot of calories and a lot of energy is wasted. And that ends up resulting in a lot of water use, a lot of land use, disproportionately so. And so that's why this is another thing from the United Nations. It mentions how livestock is a leading player in the reduction of biodiversity, which is a horrible thing. But the positive thing about this is that, you know, being mindful of our consumption patterns and being mindful of how we eat can make a significant impact in how we impact the planet. Here it says that if we shifted to plant-based diet, we could have 75% of the farmlands that are currently being used to raise food released, you know, that we wouldn't have to use them. So that would ease a tremendous amount of pressure. However, I wanted to finish with this slide. You know, people discuss, oh, is it consumption, is population? But it's very, very clear that both things are very important. And at the rate that we are growing our population right now, at about 83 million people per year, that's about the size of Germany. So if you've been to Germany, you've seen all the beautiful cities that they have. It's such a large country. So right now, we're adding a net growth after deaths of about 83 million people every single year. And so it's easy to see how even if every single one of those people consumed as little as Greta Thunberg who I believe is very mindful of her consumption. Even if we had 83 million Greta Thunbergs every single year, it would still be an environmental disaster, you know? And so that is why it's, because we all, in addition to food, you know, clothes, just coffee, cotton, everything requires a lot of resources. And because we've grown so efficient at utilizing and extracting resources, it's really something that's crucial if we want to be able to not destroy this planet, that we raise awareness and that we, you know, address this very, very serious situation. So I'm so glad that you guys invited me to speak. And my last slide, I'll poster a little bit of self-promotion of the film Endgame 2050 that Chico mentioned, in case you guys want to check it out. And I am all done because I think I'm past my 10 minutes. So thank you so much, Chico, and everyone.
Sophia, that was great. Really appreciate it. So informative and actually so frightening. But I really appreciate your presentation and tremendous graphics as well. So that was great. Our next speaker is Nandita Bajaj, and Nandita was born and raised in India, came with her family to North America, to Canada actually, as a teenager. She was trained as an aerospace engineer and worked in that field for a few years, then went into education and was a science and math teacher. And from there migrated into school administration, nonprofit administration, and has been doing that work for the recent years, in addition to continuing graduate studies. She, over this period, has evolved sort of her sensitivities and her interest in environmental issues and become more and more concerned about the environmental crises that are facing our planet, and has been becoming more and more involved in these issues as time has gone on. And at this point, she is co-host of a podcast about environmental and population issues, and was recently appointed as the executive director of World Population Balance, an environmental nonprofit based in Twin Cities and Denver. So, so congratulations to Nandita. And also we are really happy to have her here and presenting this evening. So over to you, Nandita.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Sophia, for that excellent presentation and setting the context for where I'm about to go. And I also want to say a special thanks to Anna for setting such a beautiful context at the beginning about why overpopulation is such a difficult topic to discuss, and acknowledging all of the exploitation and coercion that has happened, and you know, keeping that in our minds as we move to a more humane way of addressing this issue. So I'll share my screen. So I'm discussing the role of overpopulation as a social justice issue. And I'm specifically going to speak about the social pressures around having children that perpetuate the social justice issue. I am currently completing my graduate degree in humane education. And the humane education looks at all issues from the framework of the intersection between human rights, animal protection, and environmental preservation. And I enjoyed Sophia touching on how overpopulation impacts the animal protection area, which is the topic for today, but also how it intersects with environmental preservation. And I'm going to speak a little more about the intersection between the three throughout. One of the things that you may have come across in the last few years around the overpopulation issue, more around climate change, is the impact of personal actions and individual choices. And Sophia talked about moving away from animal agriculture as a major life choice that we can make to reduce our carbon emissions. And you know, one of the biggest things that has been listed in the Lund study, which is about the high impact actions, is having one fewer child is 20 times more impactful in terms of climate emissions compared to green energy, hybrid car, recycling, or going vegan alone. But having a child is a very personal decision. And as we've spoken about, it's also a very big taboo to talking about that. But the less we talk about that issue, the more we perpetuate the exploitation of our planet, including human rights, animal protection, and environmental preservation. And what I want to talk about today is the reason it's so difficult to talk about the choice of having kids or not having kids is because of the social pressures that are at play in culture, which are also known as pronatalism. And I'm going to do a little bit of a dive into pronatalism because I feel that that's at the root of our overpopulation issue, among many other things. Pronatalism has a couple of definitions from these two books. The first one from The Myth of Mom and Apple Pie, an attitude or policy that is pro-birth, that encourages reproduction, that exalts the role of parenthood. The second one is from The Baby Matrix, the idea that parenthood and raising children should be the central focus of every person's adult life. It is a strong social force and includes a collection of beliefs so embedded that they have become to be seen as true. There are a number of assumptions around pronatalism that are floating around in culture that have literally embedded themselves into our own identity. And I'm touching upon a couple of more common ones, is that we have a biological instinct to have children. Research has shown that the biological instinct isn't real or universal. Rather, it's a learned desire from strong social and cultural pronatal influences. There's something wrong with you if you don't have children. There is actually no link between psychological health, maturity, and fulfillment tied directly to parenthood. And another common one is the ultimate path to fulfillment in life is parenthood. And the fact is that raising children may give purpose or a solid direction to one's life, but it's not necessarily the purpose that every person wants or experiences. So with that kind of a social narrative, any discussion around the impact of our growing numbers tends to become even more difficult because we believe that it is an innate desire that everyone experiences and that everyone should have children, which makes that discussion even harder. There are roots of pronatalism that go really far back in history, our own instinct for survival that value fertility to ensure that we survive as a species. But then there are a lot of social constructs like power that are driven by, could be religion for having more followers, could be business for having more consumers, and government could be more taxpayers. And the way these narratives show up in our society, again, very much propagate that idea that we cannot talk about the choice of not having kids. For example, this news headline from BBC, how do you convince people to have babies? Very much driven by an economic growth model where we are trying to get more consumers. People are deciding to have fewer children because of access to family planning, because of education, because of other aspirations, yet the social narrative is that there's something wrong. We need to be convincing people to have more kids. Iran reigns in family planning as population ages, from another one from the BBC. Here is an example of a social narrative driven by religion, where the government is pulling away family planning resources from its own people so that there can be more children born. There are so many human rights issues in that narrative alone. But it's become such a common narrative that we have come to see this as normal news headlines. Is Moldova ready to embrace an unmarried, child-free person? Feeds into that narrative that if you don't have children and if you don't follow the social script of getting married, something must be wrong with you, and you won't contribute as well to being a leader. So I'd like to discuss why pronatalism, this kind of social pressure, is a social justice issue, both all in terms of human rights, animal protection, environmental preservation. Human rights, there's a clear relation between these social pressures for having children and overpopulated countries. Pronatalism undermines the autonomy in reproductive decision-making for people. There are over 220 million women around the world who don't have access to reproductive care, contraceptives, family planning, which is a human rights issue because they're having to follow through on pregnancies that they don't want. Bringing to life, as Anna mentioned earlier, children who may not be desired, for whom it may not be safe to enter the world in that kind of a situation. That feeds directly into animal protection, and Sophia did such a great piece on our increasing numbers, especially on the need for more land, the need for more food, and what that does to our agriculture. If we're using 50% of our land for our livestock and for our own food, that is a huge animal protection violation, because not only are we taking hundreds of billions of animals each year and slaughtering them for our food, that is also directly creating habitat loss for all the wildlife that is being pushed into extinction. The environmental connection, again, Sophia made really wonderfully, is animal agriculture is one of the leading contributors to emissions. About 15% of emissions for climate change are coming from animal agriculture. So you can see how there is an interconnected web between how all three of these are being propagated through our growing numbers. The more of us there are, the fewer of everyone else there can be. There's a huge anthropocentric way of looking at pronatalism, where we push this agenda that we want more numbers, whether it's for more religious followers, whether it's for more consumers, more taxpayers. But there's often this disconnect from what is happening in our world right now in terms of the climate crisis we're experiencing. Why aren't we talking about that when the governments are pushing for more births? Why aren't we talking about the situation we're in with the pandemic, which is a direct result of our intertwined relationship with animals and zoonotic diseases? My premise is that it's very difficult to talk about overpopulation unless we are willing to challenge these pronatalist narratives and are willing to go beyond what we're being told about why we should be having children. It is a taboo issue, and I'm going to quickly talk about some of the past history that has made it difficult. Again, what Anna mentioned with China's one-child policy, it's immediately where people go to when they're trying to defend not talking about overpopulation, or India's sterilization program, or Puerto Rico's sterilization program, and those are all terrible examples. But what we don't hear of are some incredible examples that are centered around human rights and empowerment. One of those is Thailand, that implemented an incredible family planning program through the use of humor and creativity. This was a social activist, Mechai Viravaidya, who worked with his own government to break the taboo around contraceptive use. He opened a restaurant called Cabbages and Condoms, and instead of offering mints, he would offer people condoms to take away. And he really started to normalize this conversation around contraceptive use. So often we say that there needs to be, can start using contraceptives. Thailand is a beautiful example where illiterate people were starting to use contraceptives just because they were available and just because it was normal to do that. And their contraceptive use in 25 years of that program went from 15% to about 70%. And their fertility rate dropped from about 6 children per woman to less than 2. Another really wonderful example, and this is under a religious leader, a Muslim religious leader, is Iran in the late 1980s, where the government was backed by religious leaders to implement a family planning program for everybody, where it was mandated for people to go through an education around family planning, contraceptive use, and how many children to have, and financial stability, etc. Same kind of results. When people are given the choice through empowerment and education and access, this is what we start to see. The fertility rate falling from 6.5 to, again, under 2 in 30 years or so. And the last example is Costa Rica's success, again, under a conservative Catholic president. And here, what they did was start a radio program that openly talked about sex and contraception use. And again, it happened in the late 60s, but again, over a couple of decades, they saw a dramatic decline in fertility from above 6.5 to, again, under 2. Costa Rica is now one of the developed countries with the lowest fertility rates, and has maintained that. And it also has the highest, it's number 1 on the Happy Planet Index, which looks at overall well-being and also carbon footprint. They also have a very low carbon footprint, which basically goes against this narrative that we need to have, constant GDP growth in order to have a good run society. So that's it for me. Here's a little pitch about this new organization. The organization is not new. I'm new to the organization. I just started 2 weeks ago, and one of the best entry points for anyone looking to understand overpopulation is the Overpopulation podcast, where we talk about everything under the sun that has to do with overpopulation and how to normalize this topic. Thank you, everyone, for listening. That's all for me.
Nandita, thank you so much. That was excellent and so informative. And I think this issue of how to talk about the issue of humans sort of overcrowding the planet is so difficult. And I really appreciate your way of approaching it and your discussion of the various issues involved. It's great. Our next speaker will be Joe Bish, and Joe is the director of issue advocacy for Population Media Center. Joe has a master's degree in environmental advocacy and organizing from Antioch University in New England. The Population Media Center is an environmental nonprofit with worldwide reach. It focuses on empowerment of girls and women. I'm sure you're going to hear more about that from Joe. And Joe is the sort of the subject matter, content matter expert for PMC. So he's the guy doing research and giving presentations on the issues surrounding this whole discussion on behalf of their organization. And he's coming to us live tonight from his home in Ithaca, New York. He is joined as sort of a silent partner, I think mostly a silent partner, by Bria Holness. She is a fellow staffer at Population Media Center. She will be someone in the background, I guess, for the presentation, but is going to be on hand to answer questions. She is the engagement officer, the donor engagement officer for PMC, and she can give perspective on how we can all help with this important work. She has a bachelor's degree in television, radio, and film, and a master's degree in media and education. She's originally from Bronx, New York, but she is coming to us this evening from Philadelphia. So at this point, I will turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Chico. Let me get my screen up here, I hope. Can everyone see the slide?
Good.
Great. Well, good evening, and thanks to the organizers for tackling these important issues. I'm going to dive right into some specific and actionable information related more to the causes and solutions around global population growth. As you've probably picked up already from the first two presentations, the causes and solutions around population growth are actually quite well understood by various experts, and I think they're easily graspable for the public as well. So I hope that my presentation tonight is useful to you all. Each day there are around 380,000 births on the planet compared to about 180,000 deaths. So this is what accounts for global population growth of over 200,000 people today. As Sophia said, about 83 million per year. Importantly, a portion of these 380,000 births each day are the result of several unsolved challenges confronting human rights activists and international development specialists. And one that is particularly pernicious is the low status of women and girls around the globe, which remains especially oppressive in traditional societies that are strongly patriarchal. I don't think gender equality has been achieved really anywhere probably, but in traditional societies, it can be extreme. And this usually results in denial of education to women and girls, which is of course categorically tragic because everyone deserves access to education. But in terms of the population issue, it also systemically decreases the woman's ability to control her childbearing. And we can prove this easily with a negative corollary. There's a mountain of evidence that consistently shows that female education leads to reduced fertility rates. The more years of schooling a woman has, the more likely she is to have a smaller family. Another population growth inducing aspect of patriarchy is the pursuit of large families. Often as an absolute good, the bigger the better, but also often in pursuit of as many sons as possible. And it would really be hard to overstate the men's roles in idealizing and aspiring to large family sizes around the world. For example, in every country in sub-Saharan Africa, the ideal number of children for men exceeds replacement level fertility by a significant amount. The average man in Nigeria wants over 7 children in his lifetime. And just to be clear, the definition of replacement level fertility is the average number of children born to each woman that would result in no population growth nor any population decrease. And when we look at that at a global average, it would take about 2.1 children, statistically speaking, of course, to meet this definition. Currently, the global fertility rate is around 2.4 children per woman, or about 14% above replacement level. But perhaps the biggess mutable contributor to ongoing population growth is what I call bias against modern contraception. And around the world, there are an enormous number of rumors, myths, misinformation, and lies about the safety and efficacy of modern contraception. They really run rampant. For example, a study from 2017 that was conducted in 3 East African countries found that 62% of female respondents in Kenya thought contraceptives could result in deformed babies. And another 55% of women in Kenya thought that contraceptives could cause cancer. A study in Pakistan found that women are often dissuaded from using contraception because of the belief that fertility is determined by God's will, or that family planning decisions should be made only by husbands. And I did want to say something about population momentum as well. And this is a little bit different sort of driver of population growth. And this occurs that even though replacement level fertility has been reached, population may keep on growing because of large absolute numbers of women entering their reproductive ages. So in other words, a very large generation of women having even 1 or 2 children families can still result in population growth for another generation or so. So when I said the drivers of population growth are mutable and addressable, what did I mean? Well, you'll notice that most of these drivers are social in nature. The low status of women, misinformation and lies are social phenomena, and certainly the attitudes and prerogatives of patriarchy are social phenomena. So Population Media Center works at scale to change these very dynamics. We leverage the universal demand for high quality entertainment, which is pervasive everywhere that there's human beings, there's demand for entertainment. And basically we combine great storytelling with a highly evolved communications technique. And this technique is constructed from multiple scientifically validated communication, psychosocial and psychological theories. But it really draws its power from the human instinct to learn from role models. So for example, to remediate a high ideal family size, we will create what we call a transitional character who within context of a fictional story is struggling with family size decisions. And we'll also create negative and positive role models within the fictional story. In this example, the positive character will attempt to influence the transitional character to choose a smaller family, perhaps by highlighting the economic benefits of smaller families or the health benefits of smaller families. And vice versa, the negative role model will also attempt to influence the transitional character to choose a larger family, perhaps based on tradition or old customs. And then over the course of the story, the transitional character will gradually come to embrace the idea of the benefits of a smaller family and will act accordingly within the fictional story. And a measurable segment of the audience will experience an actual emotive psychological desire to adopt similar values and actions in their real life. Basically, we've presented them an alternative set of options that probably was not available to them in their real life through serving them this fiction, and now they can make a decision that's in line with their values and goals. So here are a few examples of the results of the impacts of our shows. Whenever possible, we conduct post-broadcast quantitative household surveys. Sample sizes generally between 1,500 to 2,000 participants. And you'll note in the first bullet, a reduction in ideal family size preferences of our listeners compared to non-listeners. And in the second, listeners to our show were significantly more likely to be using a method of family planning than non-listeners were. We've broadcast in more than 50 countries since 1998 and often reach millions of people with one broadcast. It depends, of course, on the complexity of the media market. But in simpler media markets, our cost to reach a single person with messaging can be as low as 4 cents per listener. Now, as an organization, we are deeply committed to the population issue. Our mission states explicitly that our goals are to empower people to live healthier and more prosperous lives and to stabilize global population at a level at which people can live sustainably with the world's renewable resources. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bria to run through these last couple of slides.
Hi, everyone. Just chiming in here just to talk about ways to support. So you can continue to educate yourself on related issues. You know, we know there was a lot packed in here today, and I see a lot of engagement in the chat. So just continue to educate yourself on related issues and feel free to contact Joe to continue the conversation. His email is listed there and I'll pop it in the chat. And I believe some resources will be sent out after today's call. Tell a friend about what you heard today and invite them to learn more. Get involved in the cause by supporting organizations that are making long-term impact, whether that's us or World Population Balance or whoever. Follow PMC's work on social media and by signing up for our newsletters. And I will also pop those into the chat and you'll get them during the resources too. And also, the only way that we're able to continue to reach millions of people with our shows is through donations from individuals like you. So feel free to, if you're so moved, to donate at populationmedia.org. and also become a PMC party host to help us spread the word. So really what that means, if you're not really in the place to maybe give a monetary donation, but you want to continue to spread the word about overpopulation and the work that PMC is doing, you can host a similar event like this with your personal networks. And we'll, help you with that, give you the toolkit, and even provide support, to continue to spread the word about these issues. So those are a couple of ways to support. There's definitely some other ways, and I will drop some links in so that you can get more information about that. But thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Bria, and thank you, Joe. It was great. I think the work that Population Media Center is doing is just brilliant, and it seems like that organization has found a way to bring this issue to people's attention in a way that is completely non-coercive and educational, and is bringing empowerment to girls and women across the globe. And I think it's a beautiful thing. So thanks so much for the presentation, and thanks for your work. So at this point, we want to have the speakers, the panelists, respond to questions that folks have been posting in the chat and have been offering up in advance. I'm going to rely on Anna to help us to point out some of the questions that have been asked. But I want to just open this a little bit, and I don't know who would maybe be the right person. I don't know if it'd be Joe or Sophia, but well, let's try Sophia, because we were talking a lot about animal extinction, and then it kind of jumped to the matter of the importance of having fewer children. I think Nandita mentioned that, but why is that relatively more important? I mean, there's all kinds of things that people can do, right, to support, to help prevent animal extinction, or in their own individual lives, things they can do. So why is this matter of having fewer children so important?
And go ahead.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Well, because I would sum it up as a very important quality of the planet that we live in is that it is finite, right? And so over time, so in the past, people had large families and populations didn't grow because the situations were very different than what they are now. So in the past, people had large families, but the death rates, the infant mortality rate was very high. The life expectancy was low, but things are different right now. Situations have changed. And so, unfortunately, that's very fortunate that mortality went down, infant mortality, and that our life expectancy went up. But that has had very serious implications to the environment that supports us. And it is just completely unsustainable to have our species that's growing by 1 million every 5 days. It's just unsustainable in every single level that you can think of. And so I guess, so your question was, why is it important to have fewer children? Was that the question?
Why is that
the driving
so
factor
significant by comparison to other individuals?
It is so significant because it is really the driving factor for all of the other environmental issues. And if you think about all of the other environmental issues that we're facing, as much as we're trying to solve them, you will find that it's very sad that we're actually not making a dent in pretty much anything. Like even in the consumption part of it, it's funny because you see like all over perhaps social media, for example, just on the, I talked about the impact of our diet, right? And you'll see in your supermarket that there's all these plant-based milks and plant-based meats and all these celebrities going vegan, and I'm vegan as well. Like I'm happy to see that. But when you see the trend of animal foods, it's actually not even going down, not even a little bit. It's going up, and so dramatically. It's not going down at all, because any like gains that is doing is being erased by the fact that our population growth is growing so fast. There's no gains in anything being done. And, you know, when you look at the situation, you know, right now I'm working on a video that's about palm oil. And you know, I'll just give you this as an example. I know I'm talking too much, but people see palm oil and they say, oh, well, palm oil, it's just the bad palm oil. You know, all you have to do is just not eat palm oil. So we get fixated on one thing and the other. But the fascinating thing about palm oil is that it's actually the most efficient vegetable oil crop. And so people say, well, we just have to replace it with another thing. Well, no, because that would replace like even more, that would take even more land. And so you can see that it has just become something that's much more complex and that's really being driven by simply our large numbers, like the fact that our population grew by so much. I mean, can you think about whatever animal you like, the fact that 11,000 years ago, there was just 1 million of it, and now there's 8 billion, and we grow by 1 million even if it was kangaroos, you know, think about every 5 days have 1 million more kangaroos, even if they don't use clothes or all they eat is leaves or whatever, you know, it would be a disaster. So that is why, you know, in the end, that is the driving force that's driving all the ecological devastating challenges. You know, from a purely environmental perspective, perhaps, you know, eating animal foods 11,000 years ago would not have been a problem from a purely, but now because of our numbers, it's so large that everything is pretty much an environmental disaster because of those numbers. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's helpful. And Nandita, you brought up the Lund study, which sort of touched on this issue. Anything to add?
Yeah. So in terms of why it's one of the most impactful things you can do, this is specifically for people living in industrialized countries, is because we have one of the highest per capita emissions rate in the rest of the world, in the US and Canada. And every new person that we bring to an industrialized country is going to engage in carbon emitting activities, whether it's needing, you know, clothing, food, car, you know, flying, housing, etc. All of those things which end up not only encroaching on the habitat of other species, but also, as Sophia is talking about, specifically in terms of food production. If you look in the last 50 years, from 1970 to now, our population has doubled from 4 billion to almost 8 billion, but our meat demand has gone up 5 times. And that's supposed to double, you know, in the next 30 years again. So given that animal agriculture plays such a humongous role in carbon emissions, that's only going to be increasing. But the other part of the equation is that there are a lot of people around the world that live in substandard living conditions that are inhumane conditions that need to increase their level of consumption and their level, you know, their carbon emissions from substandard to more livable conditions. So it's only humane for us to be able to offer that opportunity for people to increase their standard of living. And when you do that, that means they become more high emitting countries just like us, which means we're all equally contributing to climate change, which is currently, you know, kind of the most important crisis we're facing among a few others, but it's not the only one. And I would say, just like Sophia is saying, reducing consumption for us is so much more difficult. In fact, every index you look at in the last, you know, every single report that's come out, we have not been able to meet our levels. Our CO2 levels aren't going down. Our, you know, all of the other variables we're looking at, we've not been able to meet. So, but when you look at the ability to control fertility rate through humane, empowering measures. And you realize this is what a lot of people would like to do if given the choice and the education and the access. It's a lot easier to do than convincing people to pull back on their consumption. So I think that is one of the reasons why having, children is having one extra child is 20 times more carbon heavy than any of the actions, at least in our countries.
Yeah.
I would jump in too and I don't disagree with anything Sophia and Nandita has said. I think also, though, when it comes to the population issue, the Titanic cannot turn on a dime. And so there needs to be an intergenerational perspective here. The UN projects population trends every 2 years, and their most recent projection, I think what they think is most likely to happen is we'll reach 9.6 billion by 2050 and be close to 11 billion by 2100, all things being equal. Their lower projection was what will happen if global fertility is a half a child less than what they think will happen. Shows population growth ending sometime in 2060s, I believe, and possibly decreasing back down to around 7.8 billion where we are now by 2100. And so my point in saying that is that there is no quick fix to the population issue. So, this has to be looked at as an intergenerational thing. And so each child that's brought into the world has an equal claim upon these global resources if we want to live in an equitable society. So it is a very big decision about whether to have another child or not. But I just want to emphasize again that we need to do everything. I mean, this is a global emergency. It's an ecological crisis, which Sophia described very well. It's a catastrophe unfolding before our eyes. So in no way, shape, or form would I want to assert that population is an immediate fix that can happen, within 5 years or something like that. We need to reduce our consumption. We need to reduce our emissions. These are things that are connected to population, but not solely dependent on them. However, population over the long term, most people who have thought deeply about this issue believe that the ultimate carrying capacity for a society in which we would want to live and has all the amenities of a comfortable life with good health is probably around 2 billion people. So arguably we're 4 times over what a sustainable carrying capacity is. No one on this call will live to see a sustainable human presence on the planet, but we can take action here in the future, intergenerationally responsible to help our future human brethren be better able to attain a sustainable living scenario with the planet.
Yeah. Right. Well, and speaking of the matter of overpopulation and population efforts to reduce population, I think one of the things people will bring up was like, well, isn't actually the problem that in the developed countries and because they're the ones that have this large footprint, right? And so isn't that where our focus should be? And shouldn't we quit? Shouldn't we be turning our gaze toward ourselves as high consumers, high carbon emitters, high resource users? Isn't that where the problem is? And that's where we should be looking and quit doing anything else, around the globe, kind of.
Well, my answer to that would be yes, we should be looking at ourselves very thoroughly. And, there's a lot of systemic problems which people, Nandita drew some attention to. This growth bias that we have in our culture is profound and very impenetrable. It's very well ensconced in our ideology that growth is always good. So yes, we should be looking here. But if we want a truly equitable world, I think the last time Global Footprint Network did the calculations, at 8 billion people, everyone would have to adopt a lifestyle of the average Papua New Guinean. Now, I'm willing to bet most people on this call would not want to adopt that lifestyle. That would be, if all 8 billion people adopted that lifestyle, we would still be pushing the world to the brink of ecological catastrophe. If you wanted to get, you would have to get into some very undeveloped economies in order to get to a sustainable presence for 8 billion people. And even that is theoretical. I agree with Sophia. I mean, there's just so many of us that you're always going to have impacts on the local environment at this large of a number. So question, Chico, I mean, it's both. We do need to look at ourselves, but again, this intergenerational sense of planetary stewardship, we've got to take action to eventually bring our population down to a sustainable size.
Another thing with that, Charles, is that because it's the environment that absorbs and subsidizes the true cost of a lot of things. So even if some countries don't have like the same per capita, level that some other wealthier countries have, there's still a lot of environmental degradation that is happening. And I'll give you an example of my country, Mexico. So that's where I was born, that's where I was raised. And just as an example, and it is considered a developing country, there's a lot of poverty there. But just as an example, I'll tell you that no matter where you are in Mexico and what little, corner you are, you will see, for example, people eating foods that are devastating for the planet. Like even the places where you can't even reach in a car, somehow they reach like all these like Twinkies things filled with palm oil. Somehow there's, tacos with meat, that there's always meat and dairy on the streets at a very cheap cost. And why is that? Well, that's because the true cost of it is being displaced onto the environment. So that's another thing to consider. And so to think that it's only in this country or that country, I think is not, I think that we need to, instead of, it's easy to point fingers, except when we're pointing at ourselves, I understand that, but I think it's more just of a species situation, it's not like one country versus this country, like, oh, Brazil, they're cutting all their forests. Well, yeah, but why are they cutting all the forests? Because, we're consuming this and that from them. So it's really a situation of all of the countries are in it together, if that makes sense. So that's just my view with that comment that you brought up.
Yeah.
May I add something?
Please.
And I would agree with everything that's been said, especially that global population needs to be addressed both here and everywhere. We need to be taking responsibility for our own actions and consumption and our, reproductive responsibility, but also to assume that when we're talking about overpopulation in developing countries, that we're pointing fingers is, also not that anyone's doing that, but often that argument is you shouldn't be talking about developing countries. You should just be looking at yourself. Often what's left out of the picture is that a lot of what's happening in many of the countries, maybe not every country, is actually a social justice issue. A lot of the people who are forced to have these, several kids, or women who are under patriarchal or religious pressures, don't have reproductive autonomy. So it is our responsibility and the responsibility of the governments within those countries to raise the standard of education and empowerment to provide men, women, and children the dignity to be able to live a good life. So I would say it's more of a responsibility for us to be challenging overpopulation and helping to bring that down, because overpopulation itself is a social justice issue.
Right. Well, thanks. Anna, I'm hoping you can help out if there's something in the chat that I'm missing.
Quite a few, and one question is, how late do we want to go tonight?
Well, we're going to go till 8:30.
Yeah, maybe a couple that might have a real quick answer. Joan Velasquez asked, how does the current extinction rate compare to previous ones? And I did a quick Google search and couldn't come up with an easy answer. I did find that by some estimates, 20% of our species will be gone by 2050. And the definition of a mass extinction is that 50% to 3/4 of life are gone. So we're on track for that. The question is, when will it be complete? But I wonder if the panelists have anything to add to that.
I can give my thoughts with that. So in the past, you know, even the mass extinction that was most recent one, the one with the dinosaurs, actually, when we look at those images, like the one I showed, and you see the meteorite hitting the planet, one would think that it was like a very fast mass extinction, that the meteorite just hit and then everything just died. But actually, the mass extinctions in the past, as we understand them, have taken thousands of years to occur. So even that one with the asteroid, apparently it was a complex situation where a lot of dust was lifted over a lot of time, and then that blocked sun, and then the sun couldn't get to the plants, and the species died because there were no plants. But so species in the past have, I mean, mass extinctions in the past have actually, from what we understand, taken a long time to happen. And so what we're seeing today, like what, you know, the amounts of species that are declining in decades. So for example, the WWF reported in the last 40 years, 50% of wildlife has disappeared in 40 years. So that doesn't mean that all of those species disappear, but that means that they were halved, you know, like the services they provide, they're only providing half of them. If there was bees, then they're only gonna pollinate half of them, you know, like, so I guess the answer to that is what we're seeing now is very unprecedented with regards to speed, and it is much faster than what we understand has happened in the past. Like in the past, there was also another event that was called the Great Oxygenation Event, when these little plants in the ocean started for the first time producing oxygen, and then all this oxygen was produced, and all the plants, you know, that were dependent on the atmosphere over time changed. It was thousands of years, so nothing like has happened today. That is my understanding, that it is happening a lot faster than what we understand happened in the past.
Excellent. Another quick question. Would redistribution of human populations from crowded to less crowded areas via immigration help? This is Ann Mabbitt, and she notes that when immigrant families come to the US, for example, they often start having fewer children. They have smaller family sizes. Thoughts on that one?
Well, I agree with that data point. I mean, again, I revert to a global perspective. I mean, you're basically moving chess pieces on the board, really, when it ultimately push comes to shove, because we all want to make sure everyone on the planet has, again, access to resources, education, food, clothing, shelter, and a good life. I mean, I think that most people who have a progressive bent see that as a future where everyone will have those resources, regardless if they're living in the United States or Africa or Asia. So there may be arguments and persuasive arguments about near-term effects of population redistribution, if you will. But I think ultimately it is averting our eyes from the real challenge.
Okay. This is not going to be a quick one, but there's been a conversation in the chat over financial support of our elders and our older generation. And in my research, this has come up a lot. Our Social Security is based on the idea of lots of workers paying in. Thoughts?
So this is a question about the demographic transition and the economic implications of that, right?
Right. And I think we could have a whole nother evening on this topic, because this
Anybody a quick answer to that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a reality, right? I mean, these are how our systems have been constructed. Neoliberal economic growth depends on Ponzi schemes of perpetual growth. And so what's the solution? This generation is of a certain size, and according to all these economists, they need X number of people supporting their retirement. Well, that base who is supporting the people who are now retired is a certain size. So when they get to retirement, then that people who are retired would need just as many or more people to support them. So basically what you're proposing is a Ponzi scheme of perpetual growth that would lead to infinity. So I'd say that in a in a frank way, because it highlights explicitly the need for new thinking. We will not survive in a society that embraces these sorts of perpetual growth machines, which we know are impossible.
Thanks. Well, and just to wrap up the discussion, I'd like each of the panelists to, I think Sophia described very poignantly what the problem is with extinction and how truly tragic and extensive it is. What would each of you suggest one or two things that an individual can do, should do, might do to try to help turn things around?
Who's starting? You tell us. We're just waiting for your guidance.
Oh, sorry.
Who starts?
Go ahead, Sophia. You were the first presenter. You can start. We'll go in order.
Well, yeah, you mentioned how tragic it is, and it is tragic. And it's not just sad, but like I mentioned, it puts us in a dangerous situation. You know, like we said, the environment is kind of like a brick wall. You know, and right now we're taking bricks out, and we're taking species out, and so it's still holding with those holes. But there comes a point when you just take a brick out, and just everything comes crumbling down, and we're very quickly headed in that direction. It's very concerning. And so things to do, well, you know, as I mentioned, it's pretty clear that the main drivers, you know, what the main drivers are from extinction, you know, starting with our own family size, that's something very empowering that you can do to reduce your own footprint. So small families or adoption is a great way to reduce your own personal footprint. Again, because like Joe mentioned, the population is not going to decline overnight. This is gonna take time, and the environment does not have time. We don't have time. So I think it's very important to, in addition to help raising awareness about population, and in addition to, you know, your own family size, planning our own family sizes accordingly to, you know, the overshoot that we find ourselves in. Do what you can in your personal life to reduce your footprints. I mentioned diet because that's an easy one that doesn't require investments of technology, governments, you know, millions of dollars. It's something that we can do quickly in our next meal. And research does show that, you know, eating a plant-based diet without animal foods is very beneficial for the planet and would be very helpful for the environment. So that's another thing that's empowering and that I think that we can do as well. And last thing is raising awareness about the severity of the situation. You know, the women's rights, human rights is so important. But another thing that's really important to communicate is also just how dangerous the situation is. I think that people would make different choices to their family sizes if they just knew how severe the situation is. And I have talked too much, so I will mute myself.
Thanks, Sophia. Nandita, quickly, one or two things that an individual can do to help turn things around.
One would be to start normalizing the conversation around pronatalism, how pervasive the pressures are, and allowing people to make autonomous decisions for themselves. Like Sophia said, family size, but reducing your own consumptive behaviors. So I know diet is one. You know, can you get rid of one of your cars if you have multiple cars? Can you reduce your dependence on fossil fuels by giving up, you know, flying less or not flying at all? You those are some high emission activities. And so those are 3 things I would recommend.
Great, thanks. And Joe?
Yeah, I want to say just try to get an ethical grasp on this issue, on the extinction issue. I mean, there's certainly utilitarian arguments for why biodiversity is so important, but non-human species have a right to prosper on this planet as well. So I always try to bring an ethical perspective into this. And along those lines, try to be aware of anthropocentrism as much as pronatalism, or perhaps even more. This is a social norm that humanity has that really discounts the intrinsic value of other species, and it needs to be battled. And I would never counsel anyone to be optimistic, because I don't think there's any justification for being optimistic at this point. But we cannot let go of the power of positive thinking, and so that's where I bring up the intergenerational responsibility we have to try to do the best we can in a very challenging situation.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. And we're out of time. This is a great conversation. I would love to continue for another hour or two, but I think we need to wrap things up. So I'm gonna just mention that again, this has been recorded. We will be posting this, the recording, on the Unitarian website, and we will send out information to all the attendees, both follow-up information about this presentation, the links to where you can find the recording, and a resource list for how you can get in contact with the various presenters, their organizations, and other sources of information that you can use to educate yourself on this issue.
Great, thank you.
Chico,
Thanks so
you're
much.
muted.
Bye.
Somehow I got muted there, sorry. Anyway, I want to thank everyone, and at this moment, turn it back to Anna to close out our evening.
I apologize. I was trying to unmute myself and I hit your mute button instead. So not intentional at all. I'm going to share 2 quotes if we have time. Alice Walker in The Color Purple writes, "The animals of the world exist for their own reasons. They were not made for humans any more than Black people were made for white or women created for men." And Kathleen Dean Moore from her essay, A Call to Forgiveness at the End of the Day. "It isn't enough to love a child and wish her well. It isn't enough to open my heart to a bird-graced morning. Can I claim to love a morning if I don't project what creates its beauty? Can I claim to love a child if I don't use all the power of my beating heart to preserve a world that nourishes children's joy? Loving is not a kind of la-di-da. Loving is a sacred trust. To love is to affirm the absolute worth of what you love and to pledge your life to its thriving, to protect it fiercely and faithfully for all time." And with that, we will extinguish our flame. Good night, everybody, and thank you so much.